You know that feeling when you're watching a movie and you suddenly realize the quiet character in the background is actually the one running the whole show? Well, that's exactly what's happening right now with Princess Anne and the British monarchy. While most people are busy talking about Prince William's future or King Charles's health, something truly massive has shifted behind the scenes. Princess Anne has basically been given one of the most powerful positions in the entire royal family. And honestly, almost nobody is talking about what this really means. On the surface, it might sound like some fancy ceremonial thing, but when you dig into what's actually happening, the implications are absolutely huge. And the fact that this is happening at Camilla's expense makes the whole situation way more interesting than anyone expected. So here's what's going on. You know that famous red box, the one that holds all the top secret intelligence briefings and important state documents that only the monarch is supposed to open? Well, that box has somehow ended up in Anne's hands instead of staying with Camilla. Now, before you think this is just some symbolic gesture, you need to understand something really important. In the world of the British monarchy, whoever holds the keys to that red box is basically holding real power. We're not talking about waving at crowds or cutting ribbons at ceremonies. We're talking about who gets to see classified intelligence, who gets the final say on new laws, who actually runs things when situations get complicated. This is the real source of constitutional authority, and suddenly, Anne has it while Camilla does not. King Charles made this decision himself, and it's telling everyone a lot about how he's thinking about his own time as king and who he actually trusts when things get serious. Because here's the thing about having a queen consort. Sure, Camilla is married to the king, and she's always right there beside him at official events. She's technically one of his closest daily companions. But when it comes to the actual machinery of running the country, she has been completely shut out. And that is not an accident or some weird oversight. This was a deliberate choice made on purpose. To really understand this, you've got to look at the bigger picture first. King Charles is dealing with his own health issues right now, which is obviously putting a lot of pressure on the entire system. You simply cannot have a monarch who is constantly dealing with medical treatments trying to also manage all the day-to-day business of running the government. Something has to give. The question becomes, who steps in to fill that gap? And this is where it gets really interesting because the obvious choice on paper would be Prince William. He's the heir to the throne. He's the future king. Logically, he should be the one handling administrative responsibilities while Charles is recovering, right? Except William cannot do it right now. And honestly, when you think about his actual life at this moment, it makes complete sense why. Catherine is dealing with her own serious health situation and going through her own recovery. William has three young kids who need him present and involved as a father. He is basically being pulled in every direction emotionally and practically. On top of all that, he is already carrying the psychological weight of knowing he is going to be king someday. Forcing him to also absorb every single day of actually running the monarchy, while managing all of that would just break him. It's too much for one person, especially when that person also has young children and a wife who is recovering from something serious. So instead of going with the obvious choice, Charles looked at his sister. And this is where the brilliant move comes in because Anne is actually perfect for this role in ways that William could never be, at least not right now. First of all, she's only 2 years younger than Charles, which means she lived through the exact same historical periods. She knows all the same political players. She understands the precedents because she was actually there when they were established. She does not need someone to explain to her why certain things matter historically because she lived through them herself. That is wisdom you cannot fake or teach quickly, and it is incredibly valuable when you are dealing with a government in crisis. But the bigger thing is something that honestly most people would not even think about. Anne has absolutely zero dynastic ambition. And that sounds like a weird thing to praise someone for, but in the context of royal politics, it is actually everything. You see, there was this whole system of male preference primogeniture that existed when Anne and Charles were kids. That basically meant that even though she was born second and Charles was born later, eventually he moved ahead of her in the line of succession just because he was male. So Anne got pushed further and further down the line every time a brother was born. That is obviously unfair and outdated. But here is what is interesting about it. It actually made her the perfect person to hold power right now because she has absolutely no path to the throne and no interest in getting one anyway. Think about what that means politically. When Anne walks into a room and opens that red box or delivers a message from the king to the prime minister, nobody suspects she's doing it to grab more power for herself. There is no faction behind her. no rival group using her to undermine Charles. She is just the messenger and everyone knows it. She is completely trustworthy because she literally has nothing to gain personally from manipulating the system. She cannot become queen even if she tried. So there is no incentive to twist anything to her advantage. The government trusts her, the public trusts her, and most importantly, Charles trusts her completely. And honestly, that trust did not just come out of nowhere. This was not Charles just randomly deciding that his sister should take on this responsibility. Queen Elizabeth spent decades basically training Anne for exactly this role, even if nobody explicitly called it that at the time. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, whenever the British Commonwealth faced a real crisis or genuine political instability, Elizabeth would send Anne in as her representative. Not for the fun ceremonial tour that other royals got. Anne was sent to the places where things were tense and delicate negotiation was actually needed. Elizabeth trusted her daughter with real autonomy and the ability to make actual decisions on behalf of the crown when the queen could not physically be there. That was essentially a decades-long education in how to handle statecraft at the highest level. Anne was not just showing up and waving at people. She was doing the actual work of diplomacy and representation under the most intense circumstances. So by the time Elizabeth was dying and looking at how Charles's reign was going to work, she had already laid all this groundwork. She had already made Anne into the perfect person to step in whenever the monarchy needed someone who could actually handle things. And the thing is, Elizabeth made this incredibly smart constitutional move right before she died that basically locked everything into place. In late 2022, when the Queen was approaching the end of her life and thinking about what Charles's reign would actually look like, she orchestrated this amendment to the Regency Acts through Parliament. She added Anne and Edward to the list of working counselors of state for their lifetimes. Now, this sounds like a technical legal thing, but it was actually genius palace diplomacy, because it solved a huge problem that nobody was really talking about publicly. The issue was that the old list of people who could step in and exercise the monarch's powers was basically compromised. Harry had removed himself from everything by moving to California and doing his whole thing, and Andrew had become completely unusable politically after his own scandals. So you had this situation where if something happened to Charles and he could not govern, the people technically available to step in were basically nobody he actually wanted handling power. Elizabeth fixed that by putting Anne and Edward on there permanently. It was legally airtight, politically impossible to argue with, and it essentially sidelined Harry and Andrew in a way that was dignified and could not be challenged. So Elizabeth was basically saying, okay, when my son becomes king and he goes through what kings go through, health problems, pressure, exhaustion, Anne is going to be the person he can turn to. She is going to be the safety net. And because I am doing this through Parliament and making it official, there is no room for anyone to question it or try to undermine it later. But before any of that, Anne had already been collecting these titles and honors that were basically signaling to everyone who paid attention that she was climbing into a different tier of importance within the family. In 1987, Elizabeth gave her the title of Princess Royal, which is this ancient designation that can only be held by one person at a time and traditionally goes to the eldest daughter of the reigning monarch. It is not just a nice thing you give to a family member. It comes with an implicit expectation that you are going to dedicate your entire life to service to the crown separate from whatever political situation the country is going through. It is basically a formal marker saying this person is singularly important to how we function as a dynasty. Then in 1996, Anne got invested as a Knight of the Thistle, which is Scotland's highest order of chivalry. And this is actually significant because it was not random ceremonial stuff. Anne had spent years actually doing serious work in Scotland, managing complex relationships and charitable stuff in the Commonwealth, really getting involved in the actual welfare of communities there instead of just showing up for photo ops. The investment as a knight was basically the nation saying, okay, we see you. We recognize that you understand this country on a deeper level than just ceremonial appearances. And then when Charles had his coronation in 2023, he did something really interesting. He chose Anne to be his gold stick in waiting, which is this historic role that dates back centuries and is traditionally given to someone the monarch trusts with their personal security and safety. So there is Anne in full military uniform riding on horseback directly behind Charles's gold state coach through the streets of London during his coronation. That is not just a throwback to tradition. That is Charles publicly putting his trust on record in front of the entire nation. He is literally showing everyone that Anne is the one who has his back, the one defending him and the dynasty. It is incredibly symbolic, and it was a signal that nobody could miss. What has been interesting is watching how Anne's relationship with her husband Timothy Lawrence has also got elevated right alongside her. Timothy came into the royal household back in the mid 1980s when he was a young naval officer chosen to be an equerry to Queen Elizabeth. He was not famous or pushing for attention. He was just there working within the machinery that kept the family running, observing what it actually took to manage all the pressure that Anne was carrying. And Elizabeth noticed that. She saw how Timothy supported Anne without ever needing the spotlight or demanding recognition. How he just quietly dedicated himself to supporting her through an absolutely grueling schedule. In 2011, Elizabeth made him a Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, which is basically the Queen's personal thank you to someone who served her well and close. But Charles took it further. Recently, he elevated Timothy to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, which is literally the highest rank in that entire system. This is Charles's personal gift to Timothy, completely separate from any government process. So it is a direct statement from the king himself, saying, I see what you have done. I recognize what you mean to Anne, and I am putting you in this exclusive circle of people who are closest to the throne. It is a remarkable public statement about how important Timothy has become to the actual function of the monarchy. Now, here is where it gets interesting because there is actually this whole historical layer underneath all of this that makes the tension with Camilla even more pointed. Back in the early 1970s, before Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and way before she ever became Queen Consort, she was actually in a serious relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles when he was with Anne. And Anne and Andrew had this genuine connection based on shared interests. They loved horses. They were both passionate about equestrian stuff. They were powerfully connected honestly, but it did not work out because of religious stuff. Andrew was Catholic, and the Constitution did not allow for that kind of marriage back then, so they ended it. But Anne and Andrew stayed close friends even after he married Camilla. Then Anne married Mark Phillips, which did not ultimately work out. And eventually she ended up with Timothy, who had been there quietly supporting her the whole time. And that relationship became the stable, grounded partnership that let Anne actually function and do the incredible amount of work she does. She does over 450 engagements a year, which is more than basically any other working royal. And Timothy just supports that without needing anything from it. So when you look at what is happening now with Camilla being completely excluded from the red box and all the actual power while Anne is ascending, there is this whole complicated history underneath it. Camilla is married to the king. She is the queen consort, and yet she is being shut out from the actual mechanics of governance. Meanwhile, Anne, who does not have a crown but has decades of actual work, and a husband who has been quietly supporting her the entire time, is being positioned as the true center of institutional power. The British public has basically already made up their minds about what they think of all this, and the numbers back it up. When you look at the recent opinion polls, Anne consistently ranks at the very top of royal popularity, right alongside Catherine and the memory of Elizabeth. People see her as the most hardworking member of the family, the person who actually shows up and does the job without needing constant validation or media attention. And they are not viewing her elevation to this region-adjacent role as some political maneuver or power grab. They see it as justice. Honestly, it is something that should have happened already because she has earned it through actual output and genuine service. What really crystallized this public sentiment was this moment in the BBC documentary about Charles's coronation year. The documentary gave people this incredibly intimate look at what was happening inside the monarchy during what was basically its most vulnerable period. And Anne did something in that film that you rarely see royals do. She was just honest about something real. She talked about her mother's final days at Balmoral, and she revealed that Elizabeth had actually been worried about dying there because of the logistical nightmare it would create for the government and the family. And Anne, being Anne, just told her mother to forget about that and spend her final days where she wanted to be because she deserved that peace. But here is the part that really got people. Anne talked about watching the imperial state crown being lifted off Elizabeth's coffin during the funeral, and she described this profound sense of relief she felt, not because she did not love her mother or was not grieving, but because she understood that her mother's burden had finally ended. That decades-long weight of duty that Elizabeth carried was finally over. Anne was able to acknowledge that her mother had basically sacrificed her entire life to the institution, and there was something almost gentle in recognizing that the pressure was finally gone. That moment, that raw honesty from Anne about death and duty and what service actually costs, that made the entire nation see her differently. It grounded everything in real human emotion instead of pageantry. And that documentary moment mattered because it showed people why Anne is the right person for this role. She is not someone who's going to pretend everything is fine when it is not. She is not going to hide behind ceremony or formality. She understands that the institution survives by being honest about what it actually costs and who is actually doing the work. You can see how this has played out with the younger generation of royals too, particularly William and Catherine. Both of them have made it incredibly clear that they respect Anne enormously and that they actually want her to have this elevated role. William especially has been outspoken about viewing Anne as an essential shield for the family. Someone whose integrity and work ethic is so beyond question that it protects everyone around her from constant media scrutiny. He and Catherine have both deliberately yielded the spotlight to her during major events, which sends this message to everyone watching that they do not see her as competition or a threat. They see her as someone who is doing the actual work and deserves recognition for it. And William clearly understands that Anne's elevated position actually helps him right now. It takes some of the pressure off him at a moment when he is dealing with Catherine's recovery and trying to be present for his kids. He does not have to try to be everywhere doing everything. Anne is handling the heavy administrative lifting, which gives him space to be a father and a husband, and eventually a future king. But not all three at the same time right now. It is actually a really smart power distribution, and William gets it. The thing that has become almost impossible to ignore, though, is what this elevation of Anne means for Camilla's position. Because while Camilla gets to sit next to Charles at state occasions and occupy the title of Queen Consort, she is fundamentally excluded from actual power. She does not get the red box. She does not get to classify briefings. She does not get to open state documents or sign things into law. She is basically a ceremonial presence, while the actual machinery of governance flows around her into Anne's hands. And that is not an accident or an oversight. That is a deliberate statement about what Charles values and who he trusts with real authority. There is also this lingering shadow of Diana that Camilla has spent her entire time in the royal family trying to navigate. The British public never really forgave her for the role people perceived her playing in Charles and Diana's marriage. And even though decades have passed and Diana has been gone for years, there is still this weight to it. So now, when Camilla is watching and gets celebrated by the public and elevated by Charles while she is sidelined from actual power, it has got to be this crushing realization about her actual position within the institution. She is married to the king, but she is not trusted with the things that matter. What is actually fascinating about where the monarchy is right now is that it has fundamentally changed how it operates. The old palace approach was to maintain this illusion that everything was perfect, that the royals were somehow above the struggles that regular people deal with. But Charles and Catherine have essentially thrown that strategy out the window. Charles has been publicly open about his health situation and treatment in a way that previous monarchs never would have been. Catherine has been honest about her own recovery process, and instead of trying to hide or minimize what is happening, the institution is basically saying, okay, this is real life. These are real challenges, and here is how we are handling them. And in that context, the decision to position Anne as this central administrative figure is actually the monarchy being smart about its own survival. Charles is saying, I need to share this burden with someone I completely trust, and that person is my sister. He is not pretending he can do everything himself. He is not pretending the institution can function at full capacity with nobody stepping in. He is being practical and honest about what the situation actually requires. The image of Anne standing at the center of all this, ready to open the red box, sign laws, guide the state through whatever is coming next, that has become genuinely reassuring to people because whatever else is changing or uncertain about the monarchy right now, Anne is a known quantity. She is going to show up. She is going to do the work. She is not going to seek personal glory from it. And she is going to make decisions based on what is actually best for the institution and the country rather than what benefits her personally. That is rare, and people recognize it. That is why the public response has been so overwhelmingly positive. And that is why this whole transformation of her role, while it might look subtle from the outside, actually represents something really significant about how the monarchy is trying to evolve and keep itself relevant and functional in an era where the old formulas just do not work anymore.